Who is going to testify next in the explosive sex trafficking, racketeering, prostitution trial of Sean Diddy Combs? Federal prosecutors, they're about to call a slate of bombshell witnesses who could blow this case wide open, maybe alleged victims to former employees, even celebrities. The testimony could expose the darkest corners of Combs' inner circle. We're going to break it all down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. Lawsuits allege that antacid use has been linked to increases in stomach cancer and gastric cancer. So if you or a loved one were diagnosed with stomach cancer or gastric cancer after using an antacid, you may qualify for compensation. And one of our legal sponsors is partnering with the Driscoll firm, a national firm helping those injured to ensure their claims are thoroughly presented. Visit antacidclaims.com/sidebar or scan the QR code on screen to answer less than 10 questions and check your eligibility to file a claim. As the second week of Sean Diddy Combs' federal sex trafficking trial nears its end, and what a week it is, I'll tell you what, we're actually dedicating a whole other sidebar to everything that happened this week. The thing about it is, prosecutors are preparing to call a lot more people, a bombshell lineup of witnesses, including maybe more alleged victims, former employees, possibly even celebrities, all of whom could potentially deliver very damning testimony against Sean Combs, the music mogul. Remember, Combs is facing some serious charges here: racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution, potentially life in prison. That's what we're talking about here. This trial's unfolding in federal court in the Southern District of New York. The stakes could not be higher. And so what we want to do is kind of preview who else is going to take the stand, who else is going to testify. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat here. We are recording this Thursday morning, so I don't know necessarily for sure 100% who's going to be testifying for the rest of the day. Just keep that in mind. But to break down who we might see next on the stand, I am joined by Law&Crime's legal counsel, Elizabeth Vulaj. Elizabeth, great to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks so much for taking the time. So we have a lot to get into. I want to dive into some of the names that came up during opening statements because it's a good preview of what to expect. And we heard about additional alleged victims from the indictment. So first up, we heard about this Jane. So according to federal prosecutors, Jane, this was during the opening statement, Jane is a single mother who dated Combs in 2020. She's expected to testify about being coerced into drug-fueled freak-offs with escorts, very similar to what Cassandra Ventura had to testify in week one. And during openings, prosecutors gave us more context about Jane, who, by the way, is using a pseudonym for her protection. They described her as, quote, a single mom who started spending time with the defendant in 2020. The defendant pursued and romanced Jane, who fell in love with him quickly. Jane was not seeing other men, but the defendant was seeing other women at the time, so his relationship with Jane was not at all public. This was until the defendant introduced Jane to freak-offs. Jane thought the first freak-off was a one-time wild night. Jane was wrong. And prosecutors went on to describe another alleged freak-off. Quote, the defendant instructed her to put on an outfit and call up an escort for a freak-off. He made Jane cover her black eye and bruising, take an ecstasy pill, and perform for the defendant with that escort. Like with Cassie, the defendant's violence had gotten him what he wanted. Next, we have a Mia, possible pseudonym. This is a personal assistant whose story we're only just beginning to hear, by the way, in opening statements. Prosecutors claim that she will testify that Combs sexually assaulted her after years of allegedly exploiting her labor. During opening statements, the prosecution laid out what Mia is expected to reveal. Quote, Mia, an employee who the defendant worked to the bone for years, will tell you about the times that the defendant forced himself on her sexually. So a lot to break down here first. So Elizabeth, let's talk about Jane first. You know, the prosecution obviously strengthened numbers. I wonder, is this one of the other alleged victims, right? There's 4 alleged victims in the indictment, but then, you know, the prosecution has a catch-all in the racketeering language. They say there's multiple victims other than just the ones that are identified. What do you think we can anticipate from Jane? Why do you think the importance of Jane's testimony is?
Yeah, so I think Jane's testimony is going to be important for a lot of reasons. I think one, what the prosecution really wants to establish is that this wasn't just a one-time relationship with Cassie, you know, that the defense is saying is volatile and toxic, that this was part of an ongoing pattern. So the more female victims, alleged female victims that the prosecution can produce, the more they can show that this was, you know, an overall enterprise, which kind of goes to the racketeering charge. You know, if there's similar allegations of sex trafficking, of being forced or coerced forced into these freak-offs and similar claims that Cassie made, that only strengthens their case.
And why she might not have reported immediately or left immediately, right? Because that was one of the big questions surrounding Cassandra Ventura's testimony.
Yes, yeah, and I know we might get into this a little bit later, but that's when I think the expert witnesses that the prosecution called, including the psychologist that explained kind of how these relationships unfold and why it's not as easy to leave these types of situations, that's going to be critical, because I think we're going to see that several times, is that women who were in a relationship with him or, you know, had interactions with him maybe romantically, you know, were subjected to alleged violence and why they couldn't leave.
So Jane looks like a pseudonym. Mia may be a pseudonym, not entirely sure, but if you testify under a pseudonym and you already had Cassandra Ventura publicly identify herself, do you think the jury's going to look at that differently?
I don't think so, because, you know, if they come in and testify and they're in that courtroom and the jury is there to listen to their testimony, I think it's going to have the same effect. Obviously, of course, if the jury, you know, believes the testimony and takes it to be true. So the public might not know, you know, all the details, might not have context as to who she is. So maybe in the court of public opinion, it might have a different impact. But inside that courtroom, you know, if she's delivering truthful testimony, she's being honest, she's giving a lot of details that Cassie gave, I think it would have the same effect.
When you hear about Mia, that he allegedly worked her to the bone, that is consistent with other testimony we've heard so far from personal assistants, right, who've talked about the long hours. I believe a chef is going to testify as well. Forced labor is one of the underlying crimes of racketeering. So the prosecution needs to prove at least 2 predicate underlying crimes, maybe forced labor. Is that what we're getting at there? And I don't know. There's people who look at this and say, long hours, 80 to 100 hours, is that really forced labor? What are we talking about by forced labor? And do you think, am I right that that's maybe where they might be going?
Right. I think that's exactly where they're going. So even if you have, let's say, former employees that were not necessarily subject to alleged sexual abuse or coercion or freak-offs of that nature, if they can testify as to like the long hours that they worked, the conditions that they were under, if there were alleged threats or, you know, any type of force of that nature, I think it would help to further support the forced labor. And as you said, it's one of the many acts of racketeering. So along with, you know, kidnapping, arson, the more that the prosecution can show this was a widespread enterprise, really, because that's what racketeering is. It's not just one-off, you know, incidents. I think that helps to support that charge.
You think she signed an NDA?
I would be really surprised if she didn't. I know we've talked about how, you know, there were multiple NDAs that Diddy allegedly had his employees sign. And I think usually people that are of that status of wealth and privilege typically have their employees sign an NDA. How forceful it is, how enforceable it is, I'm not sure.
But that won't prevent her from testifying.
Correct, right, yeah. So you can't use it to prevent someone from testifying. And a lot of the language that I've seen in some of his NDAs is really extreme. And I think a lot of courts would hold it unenforceable anyway, so.
What's going on with victim 3, right? There was this whole back and forth that they can't necessarily contact her, find her. I've been talking about before on Sidebars that even if they do find her and they compel her to testify, she's almost like, I wonder, a hostile witness. I mean, potentially, I don't know what's going on here with alleged victim number 3, but you talk about a preview of who to expect next. I mean, is she not going to testify?
Yeah, so victim 3 really is a mystery. People don't know where she is. We don't know if it's, you know, a former partner of Combs, a former employee. My guess is that it'll probably be some sort of combination of victim 2 and victim 4, a female victim that might allege that she was, you know, sexually abused by Combs in some way. That's why the prosecution might put her on. If she was compelled to testify and she doesn't appear and she doesn't have a good reason for it, that could possibly be contempt of court. That's punishable by jail, heavy fines. It's not often that people are jailed for that, but this is a high-profile case, so if they need her and she's not there.
You also wonder if Mia and Jane will show up as well. I
Yes.
mean, it's a big consideration. Okay, now I want to talk about employees. So specifically, the inner circle of Combs' alleged criminal enterprise. This is what you need. If you're saying that he conspired with others to further criminal activity and that he had employees and he had staff and bodyguards and people helping him commit crimes and cover them up, this is who you need to testify. And we already heard from 2 personal assistants. They were questioned about immunity agreements and proffer agreements and what they experienced in helping set up hotel rooms for freak-offs and cleaning them up and, you know, seeing guns and violence and those things of that nature. So one big name that has emerged is Christina Quorum. This is Diddy's former chief of staff. Her name has come up in the past. It has come up in other litigation. Her role really came into sharp focus during the trial when text messages were introduced allegedly showing her coordinating with Cassie Ventura's best friend, Kerry Morgan, to track down Cassie after a violent incident. And prosecutors claim this happened when Combs, apparently armed with a hammer, was allegedly trying to break down a door to get to Cassie following that now infamous March 2016 incident at the Intercontinental Hotel, where Diddy can be seen allegedly assaulting Cassie in the hallway. And here's what we know from the testimony. So when asked if Coram was one of the employees who would try to contact her about Cassie, Morgan replied, yes. And why would Coram reach out? Well, Morgan stated if he couldn't get in touch with Cassie usually. And then we have the text from that hammer incident, so a 2016 altercation where Combs allegedly tried to break into Cassie Ventura's Los Angeles apartment following the physical confrontation at the Intercontinental Hotel. And Kerry Morgan's testimony lays just the chaos of that night. Quote, I called Christina and I called D-Rock. I called Christina to come and get him, meaning Combs, to go home. As far as what happened when police responded to the scene, Morgan was asked, who, if anyone, did you tell about the police officers arriving at the apartment? She responded, Christina Coram. And then the text exchange between Morgan and Coram shows this raw tension, with Coram allegedly texting Morgan, I'm so sorry I missed your calls. I'm just so not used to this. Bleep, are you okay? Morgan responding, it's so dramatic. I haven't been looking at my phone. We're okay, but it's just so nuts. They gotta call her, right? Don't they have to call her?
They definitely have to call her. If they don't, I would be really surprised. So she was his chief of staff, right? And part of what the prosecution is trying to prove with the racketeering charge is that this was an overall enterprise, this was a conspiracy. So they can't prove that by just having Combs alone. They have to interview employees, people that, witnessed certain things that helped him allegedly, facilitate these acts that he's charged with. Christina Coram is really critical. There's no criminal charges pending against her, but there are a lot of civil suits against her that talk about her allegedly, procuring sex workers, trying to convince alleged victims not to say anything. That goes into a lot of the acts that are under the RICO charge. So they have to call her.
And I'm sure she's going to be asked if she got any kind of immunity, any kind of deal, right? But when she says, if texting, I'm not used to this, does that hurt the prosecution's case?
So when I saw that, I, like any typical attorney, I thought it could be used either way. So I think the prosecution can use it to say, this was such an extreme act that even his staff was shocked, people that he's worked with every day. Or the defense could also use it to say, well, this, was just such a one-time incident. This doesn't happen often. That's why his chief of staff was saying, I'm not used to this kind of behavior. So it could kind of cut both ways.
Let's talk about D-Rock, okay? So this bodyguard we just mentioned, he was one of Combs' longtime bodyguards who witnesses describe as more than just security. You had Danity Kane singer Dawn Richard revealed in her testimony. He was a bodyguard. He was also really close to Puff, like they were close like brothers. But this closeness apparently took a disturbing turn when it came to Combs' alleged violent behavior, because Richard testified that both D-Rock and another security member named Bonds would routinely witness Combs' violence and do nothing about it. When she was asked how would D-Rock and Bonds react to incidents of violence that they observed, Richard's answer was they wouldn't react, they wouldn't do anything. Does that help with racketeering, you think?
I'm not so sure. So I think when they're trying to show anyone else that was involved with this, possibly aiding and abetting Combs, I think they have to show an overt act. So allegations of, again, helping to procure sex workers, trying to cover up, alleged misdeeds, things like that. Witnessing something and not saying anything, I mean, that's not great, obviously. I'm not sure if it's enough to help kind of show that this was someone that was actively involved in what was going on. They would be great witnesses, but I don't know if it could play into the RICO charge.
And by the way, not to do a little self-promotion, but that's what I do. We did a whole episode on has the prosecution proved racketeering. It's up right now. I did it with Nima Rahmani. I think it's a fascinating discussion. Obviously, there's a longer case that has to be going on, but at this point, week 2, have they proven racketeering? He believes so. I was a little skeptical. But anyway, we learned about another key player in Combs' inner circle, a man named Tony Abraham, so the former CFO of Combs Enterprises. And he was mentioned by the prosecution at the end of the proceedings on the 21st as a witness they are planning to call. So we did a little bit of our own background research on who he might be. So Abrahams, who founded the music streaming app Tweedle, served as Combs CFO during a critical period, including 2016, okay, the same year that we've heard about a lot in testimony regarding alleged violent episodes. And while we don't know exactly when he left the company, there is a 2016 Facebook post that seems to confirm his role at the time. The post reads, "As Chief Financial Officer of Combs Enterprises, Anthony Tony Abrahams oversees all financial activities of the various operating companies in addition to investments built and cultivated by Sean Diddy Combs, as well as the personal business and financial matters for Mr. Combs. He also helps to identify and pursue strategic investments that expand the reach and influence that Mr. Combs has on entertainment, media, fashion, spirits, culture, and other sectors." If you're talking racketeering, and you're talking the flow of money, sex trafficking, right? Commercial sex work. If you're talking Combs allegedly using his business empire to further criminal activity, is this who you need?
Yeah, I think this is exactly who you would need. So again, like you mentioned, the exchange of monetary funds or any type of money is really critical when it comes to acts like sex trafficking, coercion, things like that. So if you have somebody that has inside knowledge and that might even possibly have been involved in funneling this money, that helps to prove those charges. And just again, the overall enterprise of it, because that's what racketeering is premised on. Again, not one-time incidents with, escorts, but this overall enterprise that was helped set up. And again, Combs couldn't do that himself. That's what the prosecution is trying to argue. So when you have people like this who might have inside knowledge about where that money was funneled, I think that would be really important.
And staying on the topic of employees, we have heard the name Capricorn Clark. This is apparently Cassie Ventura Fines. She's now fined. Cassie Ventura Fine testified that this was somebody who worked for Diddy as a director of marketing, and she knew Cassie was dating Kid Cudi for a brief period. Actually, at the time of this recording, he may be taking the stand any minute. But Cassie was asked, "How do you know Capricorn?" To which she said, "We worked together. She worked with Sean, and then she started to help me with my artistry and stuff." And she testified that Combs allegedly found emails between Cassie and Capricorn about Cassie seeing Kid Cudi, which was a major point of tension in their relationship. And of course, there is the allegation that Sean Combs either threatened or did blow up Kid Cudi's car. Arson, one of the predicate crimes for racketeering. But she testified, quote, "I believe he," meaning Combs, "saw emails between me and one of his staff members, Capricorn Clark. It was about bringing my toiletry bag to his," meaning Kid Cudi's, "house or something like that the next day." And Cassie said Diddy attempted to attack her following his discovery that she was dating Cudi. Clark also came up in testimony from Cassie's mother, Regina Ventura. She revealed both she and Clark received a disturbing email from Cassie. According to the transcript, it read, "The threats that have been made towards me by Sean Puffy Combs are that he is going to release 2 explicit sex tapes of me, one on Christmas Day, maybe before or right after, and another one sometime soon after. He also said that he will be having someone hurt me and Scott Muscudi physically. He made a point that it wouldn't be by his hands. He actually said he'd be out of the country when it happened." And it was following this that Regina Ventura said that she had to wire, that $20,000 to Diddy to protect Cassie. Kind of unbelievable testimony. Again, check it out on our Week 2 recap. Elizabeth, what do you think about Capricorn Clark?
Yeah, so Capricorn Clark is somebody, again, who's going to have inside knowledge about this. Like you said, the Kid Cudi incident really helps to prove if it's true, and he's expected to testify today to prove arson, which is one of the acts under the RICO charge. Really critical. So far, we haven't seen really much evidence elsewhere about arson, at least so far. So to have somebody that has inside knowledge of that was, sort of there when this relationship began, and seeing all of that, I think, is also going to be really critical. And especially, again, the threats of the $20,000. Eventually, it was stated in the testimony that Combs wired it back to her parents. But still, it kind of helps to prove this coercion and, again, the exchange of monetary sums, blackmail, all of that. Yeah.
I mentioned the chef. So Jordan Atkinson, this is apparently one of Diddy's former personal chefs. She, too, could be called. Now, David James, that personal assistant, testified that he actually witnessed Diddy attack her. But the thing about this is, during his cross-examination, defense attorney Mark Agnifilo pressed James on a physical altercation he apparently had with Atkinson at Diddy's Star Island mansion in Miami. And James admitted to grabbing Atkinson by the wrist and telling her to stay in her lane. But then I recall the testimony was that Combs had said, "Hey, you can't put your hands on any woman." She'll be an interesting witness if she's called.
Yeah, she would be really interesting. It's ironic that Combs had told her that, given the surveillance tape and everything that occurred. But I think she would be a really interesting witness. As from what I can tell, from what I know, she hasn't made allegations that she was coerced into any sort of sexual situation with Combs. Right. But again, showing the alleged physical violence helps to support all of the other allegations of coercion and things like that, forced labor as well. Yeah, and again, just sort of his overall nature.
Because this case, by the way, even if the jury doesn't necessarily believe sex trafficking, they could believe kidnapping, they could believe drug distribution, they could believe arson, and there might be a racketeering. Charge that sticks.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So even if the jury comes out and says, there wasn't sex trafficking here, it was all consensual based on the evidence that we've seen, there is still the entire racketeering overall crime, which, like you said, oversees all of these other predicate acts. And Kid Cudi might testify today, and he had said when Cassandra Ventura came out with her civil complaint, he was contacted by the press. He confirmed it was true.
Right.
So when you have direct witnesses like that, it helps to support.
Real quick, let's talk about celebrities. So could the prosecution call more celebrities? Well, Dawn Richard testified about a violent altercation where she said she witnessed Diddy punch Cassie in the stomach at a restaurant. And when pressed about who else was there, Richard revealed Usher was there, Jimmy Iovine was there, Neo came through, there were a few others too. Now, I don't think this is a case where you're going to see J-Lo, right, testify, or you're going to see Justin Bieber. He came out with a statement, said he wasn't a victim. We did a sidebar on that one too. I'm self-promoting so much, but I can't help it. Don't you got to call them?
Right. So it's funny that you mentioned J-Lo and Justin Bieber. I was kind of going through my notes yesterday and kind of reviewing all of this, and I did say I don't think we're going to see the J-Los and the Justin Biebers testify as to all this. But I do think, in my mind, I think the two categories that they're going to call as celebrity witnesses are going to be one tier of people who allegedly saw these things happen. So again, they talked about Usher, Neo, Jimmy Iovine being present and seeing this. Usher's somebody that Diddy had mentored when he was young. He lived with Diddy. He talked in interviews about seeing this sort of wild lifestyle, so he might have a lot of relevant information. Mary J. Blige, she hasn't been talked about a lot as a potential witness, but he's known her for years. He helped kind of guide her career in the early years. There's lots of photos of her with him and Cassie. We don't know for sure if she saw anything, but possibly. And then I also think there's going to be a separate tier of celebrities who allege that they were wronged by Combs. So Michael B. Jordan, one of the allegations that's out there is that Combs allegedly called him and threatened him when he found out he was in a relationship with Cassie. Kid Cudi, we know, is going to testify. So I think we're going to see those two tiers of people.
Before I let you go, I got to ask you real quick about the defense. There's no witness list, so we don't know exactly who's going to take the stand. Mm-hmm. But who do you think he would call? Do you think he would call his children, his friends? What are you expecting from the defense's witnesses?
I'd be really surprised if his kids were put on the stand. His kids were there, his daughters and his sons were there in the beginning. We've kind of seen his daughters, leave after a couple of days. I don't know if anyone would want to subject their kids to being put on the stand. Who knows how much information the children have, if they were there or not. Hopefully they weren't there when all this happened. I think we're going to see more of, former employees who would testify that, they never witnessed any violence, that they were treated great by Sean Combs, that from what they saw between him and Cassie, especially because that's a big part of the prosecution, so the defense has to kind of break that down. Witness who will say they had a loving relationship. At times, was it violent? Probably. They might testify that it was mutually violent, which we've seen kind of hints of. So I don't think we're going to see kids.
Well, I'll tell you what I think we're also going to see is the defense is going to call that forensic psychologist to counter the testimony of who you mentioned before, Dr. Dawn Hughes. So where she had said, there's reasons for why victims might stay with their abusers, emotional reasons, psychological reasons, sexual abuse is quite complicated, trauma bonding, love bombing, things of that nature. You're going to have a counter to that. And then it comes the question also, will Diddy testify, which I'll give you a quick 30 seconds. You think that's going to happen?
I don't think so. I know a lot of people have said, well, they have to put him on to explain that video and to explain certain things. I don't think so. Most defense attorneys don't put their clients on because they're going to be subject to cross-examination. That won't be great for Diddy. I also don't know how you explain certain things. How do you explain that video? And he's already made sort of a public apology about it, so he's already talked about that. I don't think that they're going to put him on. I know some people have thought about it. It would be really interesting to see, but I'm not sure.
We shall see. Elizabeth Vulaj, thank you so much for taking the time. Great to see you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.